Well, thank you very much, Louis-Philippe, for that. Actually, the correct title of this paper is Monetary Policy and Income Distribution, not in an AB SFC model, right? You know, I just, as I just said, I do like very much that that simulation method that everyone's called Matthias in this conference that did, you know, to very much support that work. As a matter of fact, the last chapter of the new book is kind of a how-to method for graduate students, how to do those things. It won't be as sophisticated as yours, but it gets people starting. What I used to do is, like, the first day of classes, you know, in the graduate course, I would say, you know, here's how you do this, you know, go away now for three months and write your term paper and don't bother me again. I'm exaggerating, but the point was I gave them the method to do their term paper, and then we talked about theory the rest of the time. And then at the end of the term, they would, you know, some good work, you know, came out of that. That method goes back, obviously, to Mark and Wynne many, many years ago. And Mark's graduate, your graduate students over the years, like at different generations, have helped me a lot, you know, with the techniques and so forth. So I just want to make that acknowledgement too. Now, I just want to say to the conference organizers, I very much like this hybrid system. I think this is good. Now, and the API, you know, the last 2.5 years, we've gone, you know, totally online, and it's got very comfortable for us. You know, we just set it up. We get people from all over the world. You know, some of you have you know, tuned in a couple of times. I think a lot of people listen to Steve when Steve talked about it. But I want to do this, because I think that this, what we're doing now, is what we've been missing, you know, the last several years. And easy as it is for the organizers just to sort of sit at a computer and do it, this is, in my opinion, invaluable. So kudos to Louis-Philippe for setting it up. And I'd just like to say hi to everyone that's watching. Again, Louis-Philippe says I've got 30 minutes. This was at short notice, you realize. So I've not rehearsed it. You know, I've not, you know, I'll just go through. When I've had enough time, I finish. And I hope that by the time we got to there, you know, we'll have got enough in it. So, let me just go ahead. So this is the sort of availability of it. It's a little bit premature. I will sort of, I will put the PowerPoints up on the API website. I might even just record it, you know, like myself at home, and stick it up on the API website too. And yes, please not only check out my new book, but buy multiple copies. You know, like honestly, your retirement pension these days, you will agree, doesn't go anywhere. And the next one. These are the references. I'm just going to give references by year in the rest of the paper. You will see, how do we do it? So, yeah. You will see a lot of the people in this room are there. Lavoie Sekerecha, Steve Pressman, Louis-Philippe, and me. Okay. Now, this is what we were talking about. I've argued many times, this is in recent years, I've recently settled on this this policy issue. I call it a ZRPR, which means a zero real policy rate of interest. So the policy rate of the Bank of Canada should be set at zero. As Louis-Philippe was pointing out, I don't know what the inflation rate is today, Louis-Philippe.
7.6,
7.6.
something like that.
And what's the Bank of Canada's policy rate today? It's gone up a bit, right? 2 point something. Yeah, 3 points. Yeah. So people in this room are going to disagree with me that this rule literally says that it should be raised up to 7 point whatever %, right? You know, you were expressed like dismay, I'm going to put it that way, that's you know, of that interest rate. I would point out though that had they been following that rule throughout, actually the last, you know, whatever, the last 15 years or more, had they followed that rule, we would not be in this mess that we have today. And you're quite right that in and of itself, the interest rate rise would be uncomfortable, let me put it that way, but it's only a part of the policy package. They should both increase government spending and reduce taxes, like aggressively pursue the fiscal side. Again, Joelle is going to, well, she has already criticized me in the book that Steve and I are doing. You know, you think taxes should go up. I'm a radical Keynesian. Taxes should go down. Don't worry about the budget deficit. Again, I'm speaking like off the cuff, you know, in hyperbole, but I just want to make clear those differences, if you see what I mean. Okay, here we're talking about income distribution. So a zero real policy rate will achieve as close an approximation as possible to a fair distribution in a particular sense. It will also, as we were talking about this morning, promote financial stability, inflation stability, higher growth, full employment, and higher real wages. The concept of fairness that I invoke is similar to, but not identical with, that attributed by Lavoie and Seccareccia to Passanetti. Now, a ZRPR is less generous to rentiers than, basically the rentiers get nothing whereas they do get something in the Passanetti. Of course, it's far more generous than Keynes, you know, who advocated the euthanasia, you know, of the rentier, which is about as drastic as you can get. And then what we've been doing throughout is I compare the ZRPR with the zero interest rate policy, which the MMT school have favored, which is effectively that the nominal policy rate should be zero, which is effectively that the nominal policy rate of the central bank should be zero. Now, Louis Philippe and Mark Setterfield, in a series of papers, I've just mentioned one of them here, have defined both of those things as a so-called target approach to interest rates. That is, say, just put the interest rates where they are and leave it there. You know, what the MMT people are saying is they're parking it at zero nominal. I'm parking it at zero real. Then we don't do monetary policy after that. We do fiscal policy or whatever other policies that we think are going to be useful. There are two main, you know, reasons for preferring a ZRPR to a ZIPR. The first is that a nominal interest rate at any level, a nominal interest peg at 100%, a nominal interest rate at 1% leads to inflation stability. Mind you that instability in the inflation rate can go in either direction, depending on what's happening in the wage sector, for example, or to oil prices. You know, something can touch off an inflation or a deflation, and if we're doing a nominal policy rate, it will just go forever. So you can explain, if you want, the South Sea bubble of 1720. You can also explain the Great Depression of the 1930s on that basis. And as I say, this has extremely unfortunate implications for the monetary policies pursued by real-world central banks, because real-world central banks engage in their own policy. Even if they change the nominal policy rate 8 times a year, they pursue a nominal interest rate peg, 8 times a year between open market committee meetings. And in my view, that's a recipe for instability. And I just point to the state the world is in today as proof of that proposition. They're totally confused, the central banks, about what to do next and, you know, how they're proceeding and so on. It's important to note that inflation stability is not synonymous with low inflation, which is the neoclassical idea, right? That we should have 2% or, you know, 0%. I have myself, I'm personally very disinterested in that kind of thing. If we want low inflation as such, and I think everyone in this room would agree, that is beyond the scope of the central bank alone, without doing severe damage, to the domestic economy. If low inflation is desired, then other types of policy must be pursued. Fiscal policy, possibly income policy. I'm not in favor of that, but there's a whole range of policies that could be pursued. Central bank cannot cure inflation on its own without wrecking the economy. But that, I think, is a proposition I assume that we would all agree with. I don't want to, to go into this stability versus instability, because it's going to deal with like computer issues, computer simulation issues. It's going to deal with, differential equations. It's not an easy issue, to deal with. But that's what I'm asserting. What we're talking about today is the income distribution. And as I say, ZRPR, it promotes a fair distribution in a particular sense, where I'm going to assert that the ZIRP, the zero nominal rate, is incapable of achieving that putatively fair distribution of income. So there are two differences here, with people that would support a low nominal rate. One is the instability issue, which is too complicated, to get it. I'm just asserting those results. The second one, which I think is even more compelling in a certain level, or at least it's more compelling in this conference, is that it will not achieve the putatively fair distribution of income. So, as you know, the neoclassical economists, when they talk about the real interest rate, they're talking about the expected real interest rate, where there's P+1 as an expected inflation rate. And then they'll confuse you a million ways by saying, oh, it either stabilizes or doesn't stabilize or whatever. And I'm not talking about that at all. For the purposes of discussing income distribution, we are primarily concerned with what's called the ex post or the inflation adjusted real rate, which I define simply as the nominal rate minus the currently observed inflation rate. And I'm not going to get into what do we understand by the currently observed inflation rate in practice. This is, we're talking of principles here. Also, I put the inflation equation again, which is going to require a lot of issues to deal with. This is the thing that will blow up with complicated differential equations, if we let it blow up. But in equilibrium, if P0 is an inverse measure of the state of liquidity preference, so parameters of both money demand and money supply affect the inflation rate, and therefore they indirectly affect the real interest rate. Keynes was right. Liquidity preference affects interest rates. The reason that Keynes was not able to establish that point, of course, was that he had an exogenous money supply. If you move to endogenous money, there's no contradiction, I would say, between the central bank affects interest rates and liquidity preference affects interest rates. The other terms in here, it's kind of like a cost push in real terms. W is the natural logarithm of the gross average economy-wide real wage rate, and A is the natural logarithm of the average economy-wide labor productivity. Then the equilibrium inflation rate is given by that equation. And then just to see where I'm coming from, this I think is also a very important equation. And before we discuss income distribution, I think we should go into it, because the point here is that if we say that the market real rate of interest should be zero in equilibrium, we have to, and if I'm going to argue that the real policy rate is a near optimum, we have to explain how the policy rate is related to the market rate. And so this, by the way, works in almost every country that I've ever tried it with. This is one of the things my graduate students used to do for whatever country they were interested in. They would just run the time series econometrics, and we're pretty confident of these parameters. So M0 is the markup between the commercial bank deposit and lending rates. M1 is the pass coefficient, which typically is less than 1. And then the monetary policy transmissions mechanism is the market nominal rate equals this markup, bank markup, plus the pass-through coefficient times the policy rate. Then we can just use the simple device of abstracting the observed inflation rate from both sides of the expression, which gives equation 5. And therefore, if we define R0, in Canada, the policy rate used to be called the overnight rate. So that's why I always do that. I mean, that may not be very meaningful to people outside of Canada, but now they just call it the policy rate. But I'm old enough to remember, when it was the overnight rate. So if R0 is the real inflation-adjusted policy rate, then we have this relationship between real interest rates and currently observed inflation. And equation 6 turns out to be nothing other than the Mandel-Tobin effect, which was a big deal in neoclassical economics in the 60s, but then it had to be junked, because the DSGE model wouldn't work with the Mandel-Tobin effect in it. And Eric's thesis, of course, was to show, that you can't do that. The rate of time pressure should be endogenous too, and this goes through. There are numerous ways of deriving this. I've just done the very simplest one, right? Just do the math. In the history of thought, it was called the forced saving effect. And the important thing, it implies a negative relationship between the inflation rate and the real rate of interest. This, in my view, is an absolutely crucial fundamental relationship in monetary theory and was indeed important in the history of thought. When Hayek was attacking Keynes, Hayek's whole point in that debate was to get rid of the forced savings effect. He could not do it. And Strapper, of course, was also participating in that debate. Obviously, it's almost totally neglected in contemporary mainstream or neoclassical economics. And Eric and I have been arguing for years that it has to be, because neoclassical mainstream economics just simply does not work. If you allow this thing, to continue. And this is, and this sort of gives you some. Obviously, you can put those two equations in equilibrium together, and it gives you a joint equilibrium theory of the real interest rate and inflation. So you can see how changes in productivity affect. You remember all that stuff about wage profit frontiers, and how Sir John Hicks was very confused. Like he could get it to go one way, and could get it to go another way. It's very clear in this model. You can see how liquidity preference affects interest rates. An increase in liquidity preference, as Keynes said, will increase the equilibrium. As long as people stay panicky, it will affect the equilibrium real rate of interest, and so on. So you can just work out all the different relationships. We're not dealing with that right now, but I just want to give you the background of that. Let me go on. Okay, the functional distribution of income. Now, if I'm going to use the symbol K, you remember how the American post-Keynesians used to have a markup 1 plus big K, right? This is the natural logarithm of that. So it's the natural logarithm of the average economy-wide entrepreneurial markup factor. And then we've already defined the other two things. So unlike in your paper, Theus, where you've got people sort of having market power and marking things up, in this world, the actual markup is a residual. The workers are deciding the real wage through their, through their union power, right? The financial system writ large, central bank and the financial system is deciding the real rate of interest, right? And then we've got imperfect competition, right? So the markup never falls to zero, right? But it's a residual. And in turn, that affects whether the capitalists are doing well or not, i.e. causes a recession or causes a boom. So, the thing R in here is the real rate of interest across all terms to maturity. When I do my theoretical models, I have just a simple one period lags. The interest rate is unambiguous. When we come to empirical work, of course, we have to decide, on what is going to be our good measure for that, right? But the equation holds anyway. Okay, so let's sort of put this into sort of practice. Suppose that we just have the basic data from the national income and products accounts of a given economy in a particular year. I'm assuming that all flows of funds, we don't have the sort of issues that Mark typically deals with and that Matthias was dealing with before. And let's say it's 1 trillion constant dollars. And let's say employment N is 10 million persons. Now, all this is what in Canada they say employment is such and such. They have a definition of employment. You have to work, 30 hours or whatever it is, right? So it includes part-time. It's just the number that they give you for employment. And that's kind of virtual labor productivity. Now, I've put the average real rate of interest as 15%. That is an exaggeration. The point is, if I'm going to take logarithms, I need a pretty big number in there to make it meaningful. Steve has discussed this issue extensively in his work of Piketty. It's much less than that, isn't it, Steve? Like 7 or 8% or something like.
Yeah.
Piketty's are.
Piketty's estimate for long somewhere around 7 or 8%.
Exactly. Yeah. Again, Piketty's R differs from my. I've got R plus K. Yeah. Right, which is a point that you've helped me to understand. Right. The only reason I use this big number, is this big number. And Collis discusses one of those poor guys that I gave the model to in the first class, and then a couple of years later he had to come out with like a PhD thesis, and it was very good. It was excellent. He eventually came to the point. In Canada, we have a measure of nominal wealth. They give you a dollar figure of total nominal wealth. We also have a measure of total property income, which includes interest rates. You see what's going on here? We're suggesting that the rentier, the interest rate, is determining all of these property returns, all of, in a sense. Piketty's R also includes K, but stripping out the K, that figure should, exactly as Piketty does in a way, total property income, if you want to put it that way. If you just stuck in the real rate of interest, it wouldn't give you very different results. But Reed thinks that that's the best way of doing it. We just assume a number. So we've obviously got average labor productivity, 10,000 constant dollars. We've got average real wage rate per employed person, and we take logs of that, right? So that means that the natural logarithm of the 1 plus K is 0.45. So obviously we can rewrite the equation for income distribution. A equals K plus R plus W. And I stress the difference between me, which I got from the American Post-Keynesian, the difference between me and Piketty is he just has R, right? Normalizing, you divide through by productivity. The last time I was in this room, there was a bunch of mathematicians present, because it's a mathematical research thing. And I said, I'm going to call these things, log shares. And I said, does anyone object? And they said, no, that seems fine to me. So that's my reference, for that. And you can work them out. So we've got, the firm log share is 0.5, the rentier log share is 0.2, that's the one we're focusing on, and then the wage share is 0.93. Now, there's an unfortunate thing about this, because, due to the mathematical properties of logarithms, small changes in the log shares always translate into much, larger percentage shares. We happen to know that the actual labor share is 55% because we assumed it, right? And it's totally different. But you know, and this is why it's awkward to use these logs. But it's very useful in working out changes in the distribution. What's the point? Now, again, the last time I was in this room, there are a bunch of Marxists here from the New School, and I made this point, and yes, no, you don't understand Marx. This is the way I rationalized, this thing. Marx in exploitation would occur where K plus R is greater than 0. Right? Because obviously Marx wants and therefore there is no exploitation when K plus R equals 0. The workers receive the whole of the product, right? So in other words, in the Marxian solution, I think it translated into my terms, A would have to be equal to W. On the other hand, usury was the use was the old term for interest, and usury was charging a very high rate of interest. And the Catholic Church, for example, prohibited, they had usury laws to prohibit charging high rates of interest. I'm going to argue that usury occurs, like an excessive real rate of interest occurs when that R, this is the market rate, remember, not the policy rate yet, is greater than 0. And, there is no usury when R equals 0. And in the latter case, there's a putatively fair distribution of income. This is very similar in principle, not in detail, to what you would call Islamic banking. In Islamic banking, there's a kind of a preemptive or prejudice against interest income, and Islamic banking tries to arrange things so that nothing appears that could be construed as interest, i.e., of course, that's in nominal terms that the rentiers get 0. In that Islamic idea, on the other hand, both the workers and the entrepreneurs, in ancient Islam it would be primarily merchants, but the idea was that they both do deserve something because they're contributing, to whatever is going on. And so I'm going to, argue that there's no usury when R equals 0. In the latter case, there is a putatively fair distribution of income, and the productivity is split between the entrepreneurs and the workers. And the argument here is that the entrepreneurial activity is indeed contributing something, whereas the mere possession of money perhaps is not. We have not yet determined there's still a class struggle going on between entrepreneurs and workers, not between capitalists and workers, but between entrepreneurs and workers as to who gets what. So I asked the question, is the optimal real market rate of interest on money 0? So I'm going to just arbitrarily assume that R now is 0, right? And with the same wages and the same productivity as before, then the average entrepreneurial markup factor increases to 6.6 from 0.45. So that's fair in as much as both the entrepreneurs and workers have participated in current production while the rentiers have not. Now, the actual split, I mean, here we've got like, what's the name of it in neoclassical economics? Like my mind just goes blank. It's Pareto efficient, is that the term? Yeah. So obviously the rentiers have lost, but I'm arguing in a way that that's fair. I'm nearly done.
You got 5 minutes left.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so we'll just like carry on, and you guys can then just read when I put it up on the website, like the rest of it. So the actual split between workers and entrepreneurs main determined, but because there's imperfect competition, the entrepreneurs always get something. Like the entrepreneur thing never falls to 0. So people like me that are trying to like improve real wages, we're satisfied that that can be done without the system breaking down, right? If you want to put it that way. And so, as you see, the This is fair in the sense that the rentiers get no share in current income, and the firms and the workers get some share. But it's also fair in that the existing real values of rentier financial holdings, presumably or allegedly earned by past productive activity, right, are preserved. So the rentiers aren't euthanized. Now, there is a big issue here in a transitional regime, because the assumption here is that the rentiers used to be workers, or used to be entrepreneurs. They then retire, like myself, and they're obviously perfectly entitled to preserve the real value of their financial wealth. Of course, suppose that rentier activity has been achieved in practice by all kinds of financial speculation, right, et cetera, then you've got a problem in a transitional regime. My ZRPR, the stability side of the ZRPR, would solve that problem in the future, but it can't right past wrongs, if you want to put it that way. Okay. And then I just use these interest rate relationships and look at cases. So is the MMT zero interest rate policy optimal? So I just assume that the currently observed inflation rate is 14%, and we've got the expression for the adjusted real rate on money is given by that equation. Under ZI, the nominal policy rate is 0. Then we suppose that this markup factor is 0.2, and then we would have the real interest rate equal to minus 12. Now, there is an issue with the markup, because banks aren't rentiers really, right? That's a special form of entrepreneurial profit. The rentiers are the people that have their money in the banks, but you see that makes a very small difference to the overall result. So I'm just sliding over that. In Reed's thesis, he was much more careful that he was talking about the deposit rate, rather than the final rate. Anyway, you see what's going on here. Basically, the firms, share goes up. The rentier share in the current income is going down, right? And the firms of profit. Keynes described this perfectly in the treatise, in reference to World War I itself. Keynes didn't understand about interest rates. He was just talking about inflation. He didn't understand interest rates at that stage in his career. But I've just translated it into interest rate terms. The rentiers are losing money. They are already on the way to being euthanized. And this does not therefore constitute a fair distribution. So the next one I did is suppose there's a deflation. And the inflation rate is 16%. Same markups, but the real interest rate of money goes up to R.18. And you can see revenge of the rentiers. Resources, this is an intra-capitalist struggle. The resources are being transferred to the holders of financial capital from business firms. All of us use this expression. Linda McQuaid, who you all met the other night, she was smart enough to call it revenge of the bondholders in her book. In my book, I called it revenge of the rentiers. Well, of course, everyone's heard of, bondholders. So Linda became a rentier as a result of that, and I did not. But that was my term for it, because I read Keynes and all of that stuff, which is a disadvantage. Then I'm arguing what is the essence of. Am I finished? Yeah. Okay, that's it. I'll just stop. And I go on to say what's the essence of inflation, deflation. Then the last slide shows the near optimum. Obviously, we can't set the market rate of interest, but we can set the policy rate, and it's a near optimum. Anyway, that's it.